In this lab, you created several virtual machine instances of different types with different characteristics. Specifically, you created a small utility VM for administration purposes, a Windows VM, and a custom Linux VM. You also accessed both the Windows and Linux VM and deleted all your created VMs. In general, start with a smaller VM when you're prototyping solutions to keep the costs down. When you're ready for production, trade up to larger VMs based on capacity. If you're building in redundancy for availability, remember to allocate excess capacity to meet performance requirements. Finally, consider using custom VMs when your application's requirements fit between the features of these standard types. You can stay for a lab walkthrough, but remember that GCP's user interface can change, so your environment might look slightly different. So in the GCP console, I'm going to navigate to Compute Engine and then VM instances. And in here, we're going to click Create. Now we can define a name. There's a small question mark here. And if you hover over it, it can tell you a little bit more about some of the restrictions you have in regards to creating a name, choosing a name that is. And I'm just going to call this my utility VM. And we're going to go over some of the options that I actually went over a little bit in the demo. But we obviously can choose regions and zones. Let's change the zone to what the lab is instructing, which is 1C. And then for the machine type, we have a lot of different options to choose from. And we can see that the cost changes if I scale up to a machine with 4 virtual CPUs versus a machine that's just maybe a micro, which is a shared core machine. So the cost can change quite drastically. So let's just leave all the remaining settings and click Create. And once the machine is up and running, we're going to explore the different VM details that we have. So we're going to go into the VM instances page and look at things like the CPU platform, the availability policies, and so on. So let me do that. Let me click on Utility VM because it's now in a running state. And I'm going to look for CPU platform. You can see that right here. And if I click Edit, you'll see that I actually am unable to modify that. Okay, so that's because I can't do that while the instance is running. There are other things I could do. I could change the firewall rules. I can add network tags. So certain things are available to change while an instance is running. In some cases, you have to stop the instance to change some of the properties. In other cases, you cannot actually even change it unless you delete it. One of those is, for example, the network interfaces. If you had multiple network interfaces, you'd have to recreate your instance. The good thing is you could keep your boot disk and just reattach that boot disk later on. Now I can also go look at the availability policies. So scroll down. Let's talk about what the on-host maintenance is. By default, it's set to migrate the VM instance, and that's recommended. But you could set this to terminate the instance. And it's also going to automatically restart that instance. So you could configure that as well. Okay, so this is just a little bit exploring the different options. I'm going to go click Cancel. And what we're going to do now is explore some of the VM logs. So if I'm looking at the detail page here, we want to get a little bit more information about the monitoring options that are available. We can click monitoring here, and we'll get more information about the CPU. This instance is barely run, so we don't have much data yet. We get information about the network bytes and packets, disk I/O, and we can also, if we go back to details, look at Stackdriver logging. So this is now a different user interface, and here we now have individual logs that we can explore. And we can view options here. We could expand all of these and dig into all of these different logs that are in here, and even within there, expand each of the logs to get more information. So this uses Stackdriver logging. We'll cover this feature a little bit more in a later course in the course series if you're interested to learn more about both the logging piece that we just looked at as well as the monitoring. So let's go to task 2. We're now going to create a Windows virtual machine. So I'm going to go back through the navigation menu, Compute Engine to VM instances, and I'm now going to create another instance. So I'm going to define a name. Again, this is just, I'm going to call this Windows VM. And we're going to choose a different region and zone this time. Why don't we put this into Europe West 2 and specifically the zone 2A. Let's pick a larger machine. Let's pick one that has 2 virtual CPUs and 7.5 gigabytes of memory. And we can even go ahead now and change the boot disk, because by default, this would be a Linux machine. So if we want to change this because we want to create a Windows machine, and specifically the lab is instructing me to look for the Windows Server 2016 Data Center Core image. So if I scroll down, I can see that image right here. I can change the boot disk. Maybe I want some higher IOPS, so I can choose an SSD. And I can even make this larger and click select. And all of that, again, is going to affect, obviously, the cost. I have the cost of the machine. I have the cost of the disk. But the new thing I have now also is the image I've chosen is a premium image. Means there's a cost associated with using that image, but it's billed all together for you. So you can see that cost broken up right here. Now, the other thing we're going to do is we're going to allow specific traffic, HTTP and HTTPS traffic. This just creates a network tag for us and then creates file rules on that network tag so that we can enable traffic on those ports for the TCP protocol. So let's hit create and create this instance. And one thing we'll notice when the instance comes up is that under the connect column, rather than now seeing an SSH button, which is what we would have for a Linux machine, we should now see an RDP, which is for the remote desktop protocol. And so that's how you would access a Windows machine. Now, the important thing is there, you obviously want to configure your username and password so that only authorized users access that machine. So here you can see the RDP button now. And what we're going to do now is we're going to click onto the machine and set the Windows password. You can actually also do this by clicking down here. You can set Windows password there as well. So actually, let's just do that way. So you have a username here. It's taking the username that I have for my lab account. So this is the username right now. So I can set that. And then it's going to provide me with a password. So there we go. So I could now copy that password, and if I use an RDP connection, I can then get into that. This is a little bit outside of the scope for this lab, but if you want to and have an RDP client, you can actually install one through Chrome, through an extension. You could access that instance that way, and then configure it and do anything else you wanted to in this Windows virtual machine. So let me go ahead and close that, and I'm going to move on to task 3 now, which is to create a custom virtual machine. So I'm going to go back to create instance and define a name. I'll just call it my custom VM. I'll follow the lab instructions here for setting the region and zone, which is US West 1B. And now rather than choosing a specific machine type, I can go in here and just select custom as the machine type and then define the exact numbers of cores in memory. So let's say my specifications are I want 6 virtual CPU, and you can see how this scales, by the way. There are only certain options that you can choose, and goes all the way to 96. So let me choose 6 here. It's going to scale that memory automatically for us. It gives us a range now depending on that CPU. There's an option to extend the memory, so you could get more than 39. See all the way to 624. And this is a separate option. We'll talk more about this in the slides. So let me choose 32, and rather than scrolling here, I could also just type the value in, and that's also going to adjust the cost now. Now, sometimes it's important to note that your custom machine may be between 2 machine types that are actually already provided. A custom machine is generally going to be slightly more expensive. So if you have a standard machine that's very close to the custom machine, it's definitely something you would want to consider. And once your machine runs more than 24 hours, you'll get right size recommendations. So it'll tell you if the machine is too small or too large. and make recommendations based on that. So let's go ahead and create that. And once it's up and running, we're going to SSH to the machine, and we're going to run some commands on that machine, and that's actually going to wrap up the lab for us. Now, with any new project, you get this column here on the right-hand side to help you get started. Because we're using Qwiklabs generated projects, there are always going to be new projects, so you'll see this throughout the training. You can certainly leverage this if you want, but I'm going to collapse that. All right, so VM is up and running. Let me SSH to it. And then we're going to run the free command to see information about any unused and used memory and swap space. So let me type free. So we can see that here, and that lines up with the memory selections that we made in the machine. I can also see, get more information or details about the RAM installed. Okay, so here we get more information about that as well. Okay, and I can verify the number of processors. So that should have been 6. And yep, nproc says 6. Great. We can see details about the CPU itself. So here we get information about the architecture, the byte order, which model exactly. So you can get all of this information about any VM that you create. And you can also get more information about this in the documentation. Depending on which region and zone you choose, you'll have different architectures and different models available to choose from. Okay, so that's all we wanted to show you here with this lab. You went ahead and created that virtual machine, the utility VM. We created a Windows VM, and then we created a custom virtual machine and verified that whatever custom settings we applied were actually used to create the machine by running commands within that machine.